Welcome everybody. We've given everyone a couple of minutes to join. I can see there's still a few more people joining, but I think given the time, we're going to kick off. And I've got just a few housekeeping rules to start with. We're online for around 30 minutes. We'll sort of talk for around 20 and allow some time for questions at the end, but you do have on the GoToWebinar panel, hopefully you can see a facility to ask questions in the question box. So do keep those coming as we go through the presentation. We'll pick those up at the end, and any that we don't answer, we will be able to pick those up directly after the presentation. The other thing to say is we've made in the handout box on the platform, we've made the presentation available, and also the link to the Crown Estate report, which is just very recently published. It's quite exciting. Harry will talk to you about that as we go through. So I think that's the housekeeping done. So very welcome to you all. We're going to talk today around some of the key opportunities for circular economy and in the offshore wind sector. But let's start with a few introductions. So my name's Nicola Riley. I'm the head of offshore wind within the UK business of WSP. I'm also director within our energy side of the business, and I've worked in and around renewables for the last 20 years or so, over the whole life cycle of projects. So that's myself. Harry.
Thanks, Nicola. Hi, everyone. I'm Harry Hazel, and I sit in the Sustainability and Climate Change team within WSP UK. And my main focus area is sustainable design in the built environment. I've got quite a strong background in certification, so BREEAM, SQL, and in the US, similar to LEED, and experience both sort of building level, but also large infrastructure projects such as HS2 in the UK.
Thanks, Harry. So for those who aren't familiar with WSP and our role within the offshore wind sector, we really cover the full life cycle of projects and the full range of services. So we start often embedding with the client very early stage, either in strategic bids phase, leasing rounds, and then through sort of environmental consenting, planning, etc. around that, lots of stakeholder community engagement as well. We then move forward into sort of concept, pre-feed, feed and detailed design stages within our engineering side of the business, right through construction installation into the operational phase. But we really draw on the broader experience of WSP business, really around sort of teams like sustainability and climate change team, where Harry sits in the business, and those include areas such as circular economy, which we're going to talk about today, which is becoming really important, along with other things like social value, and where we can draw on lots of experience from different sectors that we're involved in. So we're going to take you through some of those concepts today. So just briefly running through the agenda, we're going to just talk briefly about offshore wind. I'm sure a lot of you on the call are very familiar with that as a concept, but perhaps not as familiar with some of the emerging circular economy concepts around that and how that can be applied to the sector. We're then going to take you through a very recent report that we've worked alongside the Crown Estate to look across their marine portfolio and how circularity can be addressed within that, and drawing out some sort of good examples of research and good practice that we think that can, and recommendations to how those could be applied to the offshore wind sector going forward. So as I say, we'll talk for around 20 minutes and leave some time for questions at the end. So offshore wind, we're all, I'm sure, very familiar with that as a concept. You know, it's very central to sort of globalization, decarbonisation targets. We're expecting a sixfold increase in the decade from where we are today with installed capacity, and sort of much sort of higher targets by 2050. It's a mature, cost competitive renewable generation technology, particularly on the fixed bottom side of things. But it's really interesting to know, and that's one thing we want to focus on today a little bit more, is around sort of 80% of the potential global offshore wind resource is in waters deeper than 60 metres. So we're really moving into that floating offshore wind territory, which gives us big opportunities for circularity. When we're looking at offshore wind, some of the key components we're considering are particularly around blades, recycling. I think, you know, there's a huge amount of potential tonnage of waste from blades and turbine components that goes to landfill, and will continue to do so unless we introduce more circularity into the earlier stages of the manufacturing process. We're also looking at offshore foundations, cables, and then sort of enabling onshore infrastructure. What we're really seeing is sort of a shift in that life cycle of projects. So, you know, we're moving away from just a 25-year life, developers looking for extended life, looking to move to 30, even 40 years, and sort of a larger, much longer O&M period where we've got, you know, a lot of vessel movements and others to maintain those turbines. And again, you know, a big carbon impact during that stage of the life cycle of projects. But when we look at circularity, sort of the current end of life management of resources really focuses on potential for recycling and leaving assets in situ, the kind of the low end of sort of the waste hierarchy and the lowest end of circular practice. We want to be able to push sort of further up that hierarchy and access greater opportunities at earlier stages in projects. And that's really interesting when we look at the differences between fixed and floating. So fixed is, as I say, a well-established sector with offshore wind, but the circular economy is largely hypothetical in the conversations that have been going on to date. There's an opportunity which we try and draw out a little bit more today in the discussion to sort of move materially, the shift to sort of a whole life carbon approach for floating offshore wind going forward, and how we can apply those best opportunities and practice to that. And also, I think it's probably worth just noting the significant investment that will be required for offshore wind, particularly floating offshore wind going forward, around sort of enabling infrastructure, around ports, around grid. Again, carbon impact of that as infrastructure, and how we can best introduce circularity into that area. So I'm going to hand over to Harry. He's going to talk a little bit more about sort of the concepts around circular economy.
Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, I think it's fair to say offshore wind is a well-known concept, but circular economy, I think it's certainly evolving, a term you probably have seen bandied about a fair amount recently. So in a nutshell, what it's trying to do is keep resources cycling, so reduce virgin material required and also eliminate waste, which then inherently can regenerate nature, reduce carbon and pollution impacts, but also add value through any of the associated sort of employment opportunities. And it's worth stressing that it shouldn't just deliver economic benefits, it should also deliver environmental and social improvements for it to function effectively. So in terms of visualizing it, there's various diagrams and visuals you'll see if you search it up, and look, I've got two on screen. So one of them is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So this is more of a feedback loop approach, ensuring sort of multi-layered impacts. But I like to look at it from moving towards a more circular economy from linear. So that's the right-hand side image, which is what we like to call the 9 Rs. What we're effectively trying to do is move away from that linear approach, which is more revolved around recovery and recycling, to a more design-led approach to reduce or remove redundant material, thinking, can we use this material for multiple functions from one component, or can we extend the lifespan, which Nicola touched on, you know, is starting to become more the norm. In an ideal world, we shift higher up to that hierarchy, but this needs to be adjusted if it's just not feasible. You know, for example, we know we need to use turbine blades and they need to be composites to a point because of the structural requirements. So let's focus on enabling reuse, enabling high levels of recycling and remanufacturing. Like Nicola said, a huge amount of turbine blades are destined for landfill. It's up into the millions of tons estimated up to 2050. So there is a fair bit of work to do in terms of composites and how we can recycle them.
I think we're just going to touch a little bit more about the Crown Estate report that we've been working on. So we've been working with the Crown Estate for around 12 months to look at a report really to responding to the Crown Estate's role in managing the seabed and sort of over half the foreshore and tidal estuaries around the UK. This work's been led by Harry and the team in the Sustainability and Climate Change team. And we really sort of trying, the aim was to sort of clarify the extent to which whole life carbon assessment and circular economy was currently adopted across 7 different marine sectors that are covered by the Crown Estate assets. So we've looked at fixed and floating offshore wind, 2 separate sectors. So we've done a lot of detailed work around each of those. We looked at marine aggregates, telecom cables, power cables, and these are subsea, just to be clear. So we're talking about the marine environment here. Marine energy, so tidal energy, carbon capture and storage, and ports and marinas. And we'll talk a bit more later about how those are very interlinked on those sectors, and practices and standards of approach are fairly common across each of those, but there are, you know, sector specific nuances. And really the goal of that was to establish sort of the top key actions that could be taken away by sector, by the Crown Estate, to sort of address and make more meaningful steps towards whole life carbon assessment and circular economy practice as part of moving the marine industry towards net zero, and serving as a signpost for others to help people and sort of enable collaboration, I suppose, across the sector. The report's just been published. We put a little picture of the front cover here. There's a link, as I say, I think that's gone out in the handout section, and you can get, and it's we were just saying before, it's a little tricky to find, so this hopefully gives you a good signpost to that here. So Harry's going to take you a little bit through the approach, the research that we've done, and then some of the key findings.
Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, it's great to see it published. A lot of hard work, and I won't take credit. There was far cleverer people and a lot of them involved, not just me. So yeah, fantastic. In terms of the approach we took for this one, then, so there was, you know, a lot of desk-based research, which was important, along with analysing future trends. But we also undertook a lot of engagement, so interviews with sector specialists, both within the Crown Estate, but also external. So leaning on the wider WSP group to gather as much sort of information and up-to-date information as possible. We then use this to identify and analyse distinct but also common factors between the marine sectors. As Nicola mentioned, there's a lot of commonalities between these. They often use the same enabling infrastructure, so facing very similar challenges that need that collaborative problem solving. And in terms of how it's presented, it begins with a wider lens in terms of the marine industry, and then moves increasingly into that sector specific content with case studies scattered throughout. And just the next slide, please. And looking into the key findings then. So in terms of future trends that impact the majority of marine sectors, including offshore wind, we tried to split these into sort of 3 distinct groups. So the first lens is society, and we're seeing obviously labour shortages, an increase in sustainable financing, but then also the need for upskilling in this low carbon and more circular approach to things. You know, are the supply chains there? And then from a technology perspective, there is a clear shift towards lower carbon, including, you know, onshore things like the hydrogen economy, which inherently may have some risks. And then I guess the more relevant ones here in terms of resources, there is a global drive for decarbonisation and energy security, but then also an increase in cost of materials and supply issues and supply chain issues, which we've all probably seen in the last few years. So I think the last one on there as well, which is great to see, is that there is a shift to looking at design life extensions, making offshore and standardized sort of construction methods more common, and also planning for that end of life, that deconstruction and disassembly. Next slide, please. And just briefly touching on some of the key metrics and some of the findings we found. So it's safe to say that the carbon sector is quite well established when it comes to quantifying it and setting targets, whereas the circular economy and the circularity area is a rather behind, with the majority of metrics still focusing on waste and recycled content, which is quite low down that hierarchy of the circular economy. And we obviously want to shift higher up that and away from that. I would say that there is metrics in other sectors and other industries that we hope to see move into this. So looking at proportion of assets that can be recovered and reused to try and, you know, drive that circular thinking. And the next slide, I think, Nicola, you're just going to run through some of the legislation and guidance findings.
Yeah, I mean, similar to what you've said, Harry, in terms of legislation and guidance, sort of around whole life carbon and circular economy, certainly in the marine industry, it's recognised to be quite limited for offshore wind, and you know, we've not seen much of that today. We have seen guidance on sort of carbon and circular economy and metrics for non-marine sectors, as you've said, you know, but a bit more of a focus on buildings rather than infrastructure. So we've not seen a significant shift on that. I think the UK Energy Act does require decommissioning plans for marine sector developments, but that's very much been focused on, you know, how those end of life will be managed, more so than sort of carbon or circular action around that. Although there is some consideration of those elements within sort of the statutory environmental impact assessment phase, very little exists around sort of standards and guidelines as we move through a project life cycle. So very sort of much it simply lacks as an industry at the moment sort of clear guidance and proactivity around this area. Next slide, and we'll hand back to Harry. Oh, that's no, sorry, I was going to take this one. Yeah, so just I think this is what we've said before. We are we've looked across obviously these 7 different sectors within the marine industry, and really, you know, as we've said, very common in terms of a lot of the issues that are being faced and the findings and recommendations. And I think it's really important that we look across that and look across the whole value chain and how that circularity can be addressed and introduced, and how these impact and sort of interrelate with each other as well. So I think the sort of conclusions, the recommendations focus a lot on those marine sectors as a sort of an industry, but are applicable to lots of different parts. Next slide, thanks.
Yeah, I think just to touch on that previous slide, I've tried to define the recommendations sort of sector level, asset level, and value chain, because there's a lot of commonality in the sector level. Obviously it gets more granular as you go towards specific to offshore wind. So looking at sector level, so defining these at sector level is really those that we think will enable action and filter down into those sector specifics. Some of these, do relate to what the Crown Estate could play as a role, but would very much be applicable to other organisations and regions internationally. So the first one there, sort of starting with creating a consistent understanding of best practice. So I think this is either through leadership or really a central location for data communication, common language and metrics to get everyone talking in the right way around circularity in a consistent approach. The next one then we've got is providing knowledge to take action. So this could be in the form of guidance on circularity, common opportunities, and then moving into tools. So we see it could really benefit from developing some simple, effective toolkits for calculation, similar to how the carbon space have done it, because it's great talking about circularity, but often we need to demonstrate, has this choice made an impact or not? And similarly, developing material databases, to knowing what are the decommissioned assets coming up, what are the material volumes, but then also material needs in the future, so we can forecast any pinch points. Moving on to sort of risks and threats, we need to help developers understand these. So again, this is similar to the forecasting that I just mentioned, knowing what the resource requirements are coming up and establishing pinch points to try and unlock those. And then lastly, looking at really regulations as a tool for change. Nicola mentioned environmental impact assessment, and it's whether this can be reworked or influenced to ensure that circular opportunities are captured and maximised across the life cycle of the asset. Next slide, please. And now moving into more asset level, so more specific to offshore wind. Firstly, there's a clear need for benchmarks for improvements again. So this comes back to metrics and data gaps. And then secondly, infrastructural needs to be researched. So this is to unlock and identify anything that's needed to support circular supply chains. And then more specific turbine blade recommendations, really. So it's clear there's a real need to understand the materials and the processes that go into the composites to make successful reuse or recycling. So the composites obviously make it very difficult to recycle, and the inherent lack of material passports or easily accessed data on the production process makes it difficult to recycle. So at the moment, the majority go to landfill or they're incinerated, with some of the non-organics used for cement production. We are seeing some manufacturers claim fully recyclable blades, but how available is the recycling process information? Do they go back to the manufacturer, or can other supply chains pick that up and recycle more locally? And then looking at a more novel approach, do we need to reuse them as a turbine blade? Do we need to recycle them, or could they be using something completely different? So the University of Belfast in Northern Ireland are looking at using turbine blades for pedestrian bridges, for example. They're incredibly strong, so thinking about that approach and extending the life by another 60 years by using in some of those applications. And just lastly, looking at technology to reduce material use. So can we use digital models or proven sensor technology to provide targeted maintenance and extended lifespan? It's been used very well in the aviation industry. Rolls-Royce do it to target any upgrades or any maintenance. It's reduced their stockpile and their needs for replacing things just as a maintenance schedule, as opposed to is this targeted. Next slide, please. And now looking further down at the value chain, the first clear message we saw was that there is a real need for that collaborative environment to not only share innovation and knowledge for the circularity, but it also needs to be cross-sector and cross-industry. We feel taking lessons learned from other sectors, from buildings, and then pulling them, into this industry. It's such a large topic that it's just not something you could tackle individually or in silos. I think everyone does need to start talking about it. Looking at lobbying or influencing regulatory process, this is really to unblock sticking points for circular innovation. For example, lifespan extensions can sometimes be met with permitting restrictions. So it's flagging those and unblocking them sooner rather than later. And the same applies for really setting up circular supply chains. Similarly to the first point for collaboration, is to capture innovation. So this could be co-investment in pilots to drive growth or something similar. So instead of not just talking to each other, but also co-investing and really trying to drive things forward instead of waiting for it to happen. And then lastly, in relation to resilient supply chains for recycling and reuse, so learning from other industries, like I mentioned with Rolls-Royce, they capture almost 98% of their engines through recycling. The caveat to that is obviously they are a company, so they probably have tight controls over their supply chain. So for it to work in the wind industry, it needs developers to be talking, and it needs for data to be readily available to make sure that there is, a recycling plant viability. They're going to need data to understand what is coming down the line, when is it going to hit, and that will then enable investment, hopefully. And the last point I wanted to mention before we sort of go into some key summaries and some questions is more novel approaches. Could we reuse turbine blades that are maybe at the end of their economic life, but still structurally sound in more developing nations where they may be deemed absolutely fine to use? I think there is a balance with shifting the waste problem somewhere else, but it could very much add social value. But that was trying to summarize into a few slides was difficult. Obviously, there's a lot of moving pieces and there's a lot of other things going on. I think every week something more gets published, so it's something in an area to keep an eye on. So appreciating that was quite heavy content for the last few slides. I want to try and sum up in some takeaways really from today. So the first one is that circularity is going to be expected. We're already seeing this in leasing rounds, in tender questions, and very well we expect it to be into regulations. I think in some regions internationally that's already the case. Secondly, I've mentioned it multiple times, but I feel it's very important, is this collaboration piece. So it's really important to ensure we've got that common understanding to highlight focal points for action and then drive innovation. And then lastly, most importantly from my perspective, is this whole life thinking, is that whilst there is a fair focus on reuse and recycling of blades, I think we need to look at the design and decisions made pre-development to reduce material requirements, extend lifespan, before we then just focus on end of life in terms of recycling and lifespan extension. So that is what we've been through. That's all the slides we've got. Appreciate what we got. Not too bad time wise. Really appreciate your time. So we've got some time for questions now, which is great. The presentation and the report we've just summarised is available on the handouts tab in the chat. You should see it there. So I'm just going to look at the chat to see what questions have come through. Right, the first one then. what we've got is how could offshore decommissioning, oil and gas decommissioning, be leveraged to support circular economy in offshore wind? So Nicola, I'm happy to take that one. I probably covered it previously in the slides, but it's really to look at that supply chain for that recycling and reuse. I think many of the published decommissioning plans that we've seen state that material will be recovered by recycling. Where's that going? If there isn't a supply chain in place, it could very much end up in landfill. I think the other area for improvement certainly is the recoverability. So you see a lot of buried assets left in situ. Can we learn from this? Can we improve recoverability? Marine sector, is it feasible to recover them? Cognizant of seabed disturbance. Have a look, I've got another one here. Nicola, I think this might be a good one for you. Are there any lessons to be learned from other global regions? Offshore wind.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've looked at that as part of the bit of research that we've done. We know that obviously there's ongoing leasing rounds, and social value we know is going to become very key in the UK market, but also elsewhere. Australia, for example, I think in the latest leasing round, there is a lot of, I guess, current guidance around seabed leases, but it's very much focused on local economies, socioeconomic impacts, communities, etc. It's quite quiet on sort of emissions around projects and carbon. I think in the New York solicitation, I think there is a question around design and responsible disposal, etc., in that design, and how that recycling element might come. It probably doesn't go far enough, but we are seeing emerging topics and themes emerging around that. And I think really, it's really important globally. And I think what I would say is, from people here today attending, if there is any if any knowledge of that going on more globally, then be really keen and to learn more actually, and how we can apply that, because our research focused quite heavily on the UK market. So, but yes, it is a hot topic, and it will continue to be a growing topic.
Thanks, Nicola. Another one here. I'm happy to take this one. Any emerging innovation in blade end of life? I think I touched on some of this earlier, but I think there's a little bit more to it. So whilst there is companies looking at blade end of life and claiming to be fully recyclable, and I think the key there is the supply chain set up for that. Is it going back to manufacture? Is it not? But then also, where is the recycling taking place? There's a real opportunity there for symbiosis in industrial. So if you've got the recycling plant in close proximity to the manufacturer, you limit down that material transport, and ultimately you probably end up ensuring that the recycling process is giving you the materials and the quality that you want straight into the manufacturer. So I think there's an opportunity there. It's moving very quickly, so I think you will see a fair few more innovation coming very, very shortly. Another one we've got through, more broad, Nicola, but what are the benefits of the industry shifting to floating offshore wind?
Well, I think look, we've talked about the benefits, because the benefits here, are we can really, there's an opportunity to embed circularity best practice at a much earlier stage. We've got a lot of shoreside infrastructure. Ports will play an increasingly important role as sort of those integration ports, that onshore element of the construction phase. We move less to that offshore installation phase. So I think there's lots of opportunities around that. It's down to a little bit around collaboration that we've talked about. There's a real opportunity here for developers, port owners, operators, the grid and the transmission operators, etc., to come together and share that best practice and really sort of collaboratively look at that. Supply chain may continue to be an issue, so in terms of sort of local content, particularly around manufacturing and how we look at that circularity at that stage. But I think it is about, as you said, Harry, before, building that sort of supply chain resilience, and working more locally to see how we can address some of those challenges.
Right, thanks, Nick. I think we've got time for one more. Let's have a look. Nicola, this might be one for you. What are we seeing from a regulatory perspective in regards to circular economy, carbon, social value, that piece? I guess from a
I
UK
think there's,
perspective.
yeah, I think that, yeah, it's certainly in the UK, and that's what we talk about. And again, we're welcome from others who, from more globally, if they've got sort of input into that. But we are seeing sort of the upcoming Celtic Sea leasing round. We're seeing a lot more of the social value importance of that as a sort of a criteria being released by the Crown Estate. We believe that there will be more that's needed around this circular economy, as well as biodiversity and sort of more general sustainability. I would expect that there should be that shift towards the guidance that's needed, to put this more to the forefront. But I think it will be, as we've said, a collaborative effort, and there's probably an onus on industry to help drive that and sort of and feed some of those discussions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nicola. I think we're not too bad on timekeeping, a couple of minutes over, so we'll wrap up there, and really appreciate everyone's time attending today's session. Is there anything we haven't managed to answer? We can go back to you direct, and if you've got any queries or any more information, then please fire it our way. We'd be more than happy to chat offline.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you.